So today we venture onto our rice paper road again and we look at the first of the theories of the rapture. And the first theory is what they would call pre-tribulation rapture. This view of the rapture is that the church will be raptured and go to be with Jesus before the tribulation. And this works from the basis of taking a separate view of the tribulation, that it relates to the people and the nation of Israel and not the church. It focuses on God's plans for Israel being fulfilled through the tribulation, and believes that Jesus is coming from heaven to rescue us from the wrath of God, 1 Thessalonians 1 verse 10. And on the basis that in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 9, Paul talks about not pouring God's wrath on us. The context of what he's writing there is all about the second coming. So as we approach this, my intention has always been to give you a biblical foundation for the view, and to give you a biblical foundation for each view, and try to not let my own views influence your understanding of what the Bible has to say. So as I present each of the views and a biblical basis for these, my prayer is that you would be able to understand and get a sense for yourself of what you believe God's word is about. But never lose sight of the big picture, and that big picture is that Jesus is coming back for his church. So fasten your seatbelt, because we're going to move quite quickly through a number of Bible verses. Beginning in Revelation 19, and what we see at the end of the tribulation in Revelation 19 as Jesus comes back, is the people who hold this view would say it doesn't mention a resurrection at the second coming, and refers in the same way onto Zechariah 14, where Zechariah is talking about the return of Jesus. And again, there's no mention of a resurrection there. And the argument being there's no resurrection when Jesus returns because the church has already been raptured. In Matthew 24 and verse 42, when Jesus talks about, an unknown time of return, the Bible talks about a known period of the tribulation. So if Jesus is talking, in the context of the rapture, about not knowing the time, we've actually had a time that's been given to us by Daniel of 7 years from the start of a tribulation. So therefore, people of this view says if we know the time scale, we would know the time, therefore the rapture must happen before the tribulation. People with this view also hold that the church is mentioned 22 times in Revelation chapters 1 to 3, but is then absent until Revelation 22 verse 17. And also in Revelation 4 verse 1, believe that when John is called up to heaven to get the vision of Revelation, this is actually a prophetic picture of the church being called up to heaven, because that door in heaven is not opened again until you get to Revelation 19 verse 11. Other biblical reasons for coming to this view is that in 2 Timothy 4 and in 1 Peter 5, there's reference to believers receiving their crowns of reward from Jesus at his return. But in Revelation 4, the 24 elders before the throne have their crowns. And so the argument is that if they've got their crowns, they must have received those already. In Zechariah 14, Zechariah references that when the Lord comes, he will come with his holy ones. And in Revelation 19 verse 14, the holy ones are already there in heaven. We see that in verse 8. And in Revelation 3 verse 10, John says the Spirit says to the church that the church will be kept safe from the hour of testing. In Matthew 22, we see when the dead rise, they will be like the angels. And in John 14, when Jesus says he's going to prepare a place in heaven and take us to be there, then the second coming that happens in Revelation 19 is when Jesus comes back to earth. So the argument is believers are already with Jesus at this point. Another of the biblical reasons for why people believe in a pre-tribulation rapture is because all of the references that we've heard about the Antichrist being restrained until the appointed time, the argument is that what's actually restraining and holding back the Antichrist is the church. And so when Jesus opens the scrolls, the church has been removed and therefore restraint has been removed. And in Matthew 25, when Jesus talks about separating the sheep and the goats at his second coming, the rapture has already happened, so therefore it's not required to separate believers. So therefore, what's being summed up in in Matthew 25 is a reference to the believers who have survived the tribulation being sifted, because if people have been raptured, they've already been removed. So the only reason you need to separate sheep and goats is because you've got to the end of a tribulation and you're separating those who believe and those who don't. These are some of the arguments for believing in the rapture happening before the tribulation. And part of the argument with this is where our understanding of what the wrath of God is. What we see when we read through Revelation is that Jesus removes the restraints in Revelation 6, and we see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse ride out. And some people would argue that that is the wrath of God. However, in Revelation 15, when we see more plagues being poured out, those plagues are actually called the wrath of God in Revelation 15. And so what we have is we have a jigsaw puzzle. We have a number of different perceptions, but biblically based reasons for believing in a pre-tribulation rapture. For you, I would encourage you to maybe look at some of these verses or maybe listen again and weigh up the evidence for yourself. But please never lose sight that whenever the church is raptured, it's a picture that Jesus is coming back for the bride that he loves.